Greetings. My name is John Lane. I'm senior pastor of the Arbor Church in Spring Arbor and Free Methodist History and Polity teacher for the Southern Michigan Conference. So I'm recording videos because the videos that we had tried to record didn't work. So I'm just recording the lectures and the PowerPoints or the Google Slides. The downside of this is that you really don't get to have a lot of Q&A unless you send me some questions, but for those of you that were unable to make it or those that may be using this material in the future, welcome. We're glad that you're excited. You're part of the History and Polity course, and we're excited that you're on your way towards ordination. So this class is specifically focused in on history and polity. B.T. Roberts said this: if the Lord was manifest among us, then old and young, rich and poor would flock to our churches, not to admire the architecture and listen to fine performances, but to save their souls. This is a great quote by B.T. Roberts, that one of the things that we've always been focused in on is the manifest presence of the Lord, and not people flocking to our churches just because of our architecture or our services, but really so that their souls may be saved. So what is history and polity? History is the whole series of past events connected with someone or something. Specifically for us, we're going to be focused in on Free Methodist history. We're not going to talk about every viewpoint or every church in the 2,000 years of church history. We're going to focus in on the Free Methodist Church and its founding out of the Methodist Episcopal Church. We're also not going to spend any time really talking about the theories of history and what can we know, because that's a pretty huge debate. So history is simply a series of past events connected with the Free Methodist Church. That's what we're focusing in on. Polity is the operational and governance structure of a church, especially ecclesiastical polity or a Christian denomination. It denotes the ministerial structure of a church and the authority relationships between churches. It relates closely to ecclesiology, or the study of the church, the study in doctrine and theology relating to church organization. So it's how does the Free Methodist Church function? How does it operate? How does it govern itself in order to accomplish the mission of Jesus? We do things our way and differently perhaps than other churches, and they do it different than we do. And so we're just going to talk about how it is that we are structured. There's areas of polity and structure, such as authority, general conference, bishops, how are decisions made, annual conferences, superintendents. And then there's financial and financial responsibility and obligations, such as EPP, or equal participation plan that goes to the denomination, conference support missions. Then there's information about ordination and credentialing, that journey that you are on, conference structure, the local, the conference BOA, the Ministry Appointments Committee, the Ministry Education Guidance Board, many other things. We're going to talk about a lot of this. Local church structure, the society, membership, board of administration, delegates, pastor's cabinet, all different kinds of things in a local church structure. And then there's hanging chads. If you know what that means, if you don't know what it means, Google it. Areas that don't seem to fit in different places, but we need to talk about it, like networks that are in the Free Methodist Church, and church plants and missions, loan funds, chaplains, and universities, and really asking the question, are we aligned in our vision? Are we heading in the same direction, rowing in the same direction? That's what this class is about. As we are part of a denomination together, a movement together, there are agreed upon principles, and these are just important for you to know. I want to recognize that how you may be wired is different than how other people are wired. So there's a continuum of personalities and beliefs. You may lean towards what's called rigid traditionalism, or on the other side, loose spiritualism, that anything goes. Or you may lean towards, maybe not know it, morphological fundamentalism, which is morphological means form. So the idea of morphological fundamentalism is that there's a form of specific fundamental things we must believe and they cannot be changed. Or you may lean on the other side, ahistorical spiritualism, or whatever seems to be the spirit of the time that they go with. On one side, the structure can't be changed. On the other side, structures are irrelevant. One side, we shall not be moved. The other side, we shall not be changed. So, we're all kind of wired differently in this, and hopefully we find our way together in this history and polity class. There is a continuum of polity within our system. There are things that are set in stone that really cannot be changed. And then there are things that are negotiable, changeable at our annual conference, general conference. And then there's just personal and church preference that as you listen to the Holy Spirit, how he leads you, how he leads your church is different than how it'll be the church up the road. Two things that are set in stone in the Free Methodist Church are summarized well by B.T. Roberts: to maintain the biblical standard of Christianity and to preach the gospel to the poor. These two things, maintaining the Bible standard of Christianity and preaching the gospel to the poor, are foundational things in the Free Methodist Church. It's one of the reasons I'm a Free Methodist. We like to say it this way, that we're focused in on holiness of heart and life and ministry to and with the poor. These two elements have been a deep part of the Free Methodist Church for 180 plus years. Holiness of heart and life, the seeking of the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and transforming of ourselves. And then ministry to and with the poor, that this transformation happens within culture as people get to know who the Lord is, and we meet real needs that people that are impoverished and outside of systems have. So these two things are deeply important in the Free Methodist Church. We're talking really about doctrine, discipline, and spirit. This is actually a book, Doctrine, Discipline, and Spirit, that was written by Kevin Watson, came out this year in 2024, about Methodism in America, that there's doctrine, certain things that we believe, there's discipline, practices that we do, and then the spirit or the culture of how we do it. So in the Free Methodist Church, you can summarize it this way. This is how I would do it, that our doctrine focuses in on holiness and justice, that's the lens. We really do see the world through holiness and through ministry to the poor, justice. Our spirit or our culture focuses in on earnestness, that we really are about being earnest in our Christianity, being people that are excited about our walk with the Lord and pressing in with seriousness. And then our discipline, how we function, we focus in on mutual accountability, that this is not a do it on your own movement, that we need one another in order to grow in Christ. I wanted to read this excerpt. Actually, it's the whole introduction from the 1860 Book of Discipline. And we read this in class, and so I'm going to read it to you. You could read it, and I encourage you to. This is what B.T. Roberts said, and the founders, the year that they were formed, and the Book of Discipline, which goes all the way back into the Methodist movement, into the Church of England, the Anglican Church, having a Book of Discipline that orders ourselves. B.T. Roberts adopted much of the Methodist Episcopal Book of Discipline, but then they wrote this introduction. And so just listen to this, read along, and listen for doctrine, discipline, and spirit as we read this. And it'll give you a good taste and flavor of what it is that the early Free Methodists were about. And this is what it says. The Free Methodist Church had its origin in necessity and not in choice. It did not grow out of a secession nor out of an unsuccessful attempt to bring about a reform in the government of the church. Those concerned in its formation never expected a separation from the Methodist Episcopal Church until they were unjustly excluded from its pale. They sought redress at the proper tribunal. It was not granted. Even a candid hearing was denied them, thus thrown out, and the possibility of a restoration being cut off. And believing that God still called them to labor for the salvation of souls, they had no alternative but to form a new organization. In doctrine, discipline, and spirit, there's that phrase, they were Methodists, and hence they could not offer themselves to any other denomination. By the way, this is fairly long. It's like 10, 12 slides, so hang in. The issue on which they were thrust out was between dead formalism and the life and power of godliness, and so they could not feel at home with those branches of the Methodist family into whose formation other questions mainly entered. Jesus has always had a people, a plain, humble, earnest people, to preach the gospel to the poor and to spread scriptural holiness throughout the world. We believe the Methodists were raised up for this purpose. God was with them and gave them great success in saving souls. Did you hear it? Preach the gospel to the poor and spread scriptural holiness throughout the world. But as they grew strong and wealthy, pride and love of popularity crept in among the Methodists. The discipline was too generally unheeded. It became obvious to the most casual observer that there was, among many of the ministers and members of the ME Church in the United States, a very wide and growing departure from the original spirit of Methodism. This departure is also seen in the alterations that have been recently made in the Book of Discipline. That's 1860 recently. In 1852, the rule requiring our houses of worship to be built plain and with free seats was effectually neutralized by adding the words, wherever practical. Conformity to the world was greatly encouraged in 1856 by revealing the law which had stood in the discipline from the first, forbidding the reception of members until they had laid off superfluous ornaments. That's wedding rings and other jewelry and things like that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Substituting a simple exhortation to conform to the spirit of the apostolic precept, as though plain commands of God could be violated without violating their spirit. In the Genesee Conference, this departure from the old paths was hastened by the connection of several of its prominent members with secret societies. These, bound together by a tie unknown to the rest of the body and laying their plans in the strictest secrecy, formed a solid nucleus around which the formal and the aspiring naturally allied. A portion of the conference wished to adhere to primitive Methodism. They loved the doctrine of holiness and preached it with success. Their labors were prospered and their services were sought for. While they had the countenance of the bishops, they were unmolested. At the General Conference of the ME Church held in 1856, the bishops took a decided stand against the enactment of a law excluding slaveholders from the church. They did away with it. A secret society, worldly policy members of the Genesee Conference, some of whom had been radical abolitionists, sided with the bishops on the slavery question. At its next session, 30 of them combined together to not take work unless Reverend Stiles and Reverend Kingsley, men whose sympathies and labors were for the promotion of spiritual religion, were removed from the cabinet. So we're not going to take a church, we're not going to preach until these two guys that are abolitionists are kicked out of the church. They were transferred and their places supplied by such men as the 30 who with their adherents were henceforth known as the Regency, a secret group of people, could render subservient for their purposes. But the work of holiness went on. Dead and formal ministers were in no better demand than before. That's a funny statement. That nobody wanted these dead and formal ministers, but, they still were a part of the church. And it was the people that were preaching holiness and ministry to the poor and trying to get rid of slaveholding that everybody wanted. But anyway, at the next session of the Genesee Conference, in a secret meeting held by the Regency, these men that were often Masonic lodge and connected together, they voted to bring Reverend B.T. Roberts and Reverend W.C. Kendall to trial. Charges were recommended. Mr. Roberts was voted guilty of immoral and unchristian conduct for publishing in the Northern Independent in an article entitled New School Methodism, things that were not in the article or in any other that he ever wrote. His character was then passed, and he was sent out to preach. For the want of time, Mr. Kendall's trial was deferred. At the next conference, they said he was okay, they just slapped his hand. But at the next conference, held in Perry in October, secret meetings of the Regency were held, as had been done at the two preceding sessions. Mr. Roberts was then charged with contumacy, which is a stubborn refusal to obey or comply with authority. I put that in for you. For publishing and circulating a second edition of New School Methodism, and a pamphlet signed by George W. Estes, which gave a short account of the trial of the year preceding. On this charge, and on the testimony of only one witness, whose veracity was fully impeached, Mr. Roberts was expelled from the conference and from the Methodist Episcopal Church. Mr. Creary was also expelled at the same time on the same charges, so they were kicked out for stubborn refusal to obey or comply with authority because they had written these documents calling out the New School Methodists, which were not in alignment with Old School Methodism. Called of God to preach, they could not cease because the human authority with which they had been invested was thus taken away. The members of the church who had witnessed their labors and their spirit thought that they should still endeavor to save their fellow man. 195 prominent laymen met in convention at Albion December 1st in 1858 in the Laymen's Convention. They passed resolutions expressing and recommending them to continue to labor for the salvation of souls, though the lay people tried their best to try to hold off these trials and get the Methodist Episcopal Church in that area back on track. At the next session of the General Conference held at Brockport in October 1858, Reverend Stiles and C.D. Burlingham and J.W. Wells and W. Cooley were expelled for contumacy themselves and sympathizing with those who had been expelled the year earlier. Reverends J.W. Reddy and H.H. Farnsworth were located for the same cause. Members of the church who manifested an active sympathy with the expelled preachers were themselves expelled in large numbers. Many were without their consent and contrary to the wishes read out by the preachers as withdrawn. They kicked out the lay people. Among both these classes were many of undoubted piety and of long standing in the church who had contributed largely by their money and their influence to its prosperity and whose love for it was unabated. 1,500 members of the ME Church within the bounds of the Genesee Conference respectfully petitioned the General Conference at its session in Buffalo in May 1860 to investigate the judicial action of the Genesee Conference. A committee of 42 was appointed for that purpose. A memorial setting forth the grievances complained of and affidavits and documents substantiating the complaints were presented. A determined effort to get the committee discharged was made by the partisans of the majority of Genesee Conference. The committee was discharged and investigation was suppressed. So they were trying to figure out what just happened. Let's investigate why they got kicked out. And it was suppressed, so even the follow-up didn't work. The appeal cases were summarily disposed of. That of Reverend Burlingham, who from the time of his expulsion desisted from all public efforts to do good to the souls of men, was, without the shadow of a reason, he was sent back for a new trial. Upon the first appeal of Mr. Roberts, that formed the verdict of reproof, the committee stood equally divided. The other appeals were not entertained, though the Constitution of the ME Church declares in the most emphatic manner that the General Conference shall not deprive the ministers of the privilege of appeal. The same General Conference authorized the preachers to go beyond the bounds of their charges to obtain a committee to try their members. Under the new rule, the work of expulsion went on. Pious men, long known for their strong attachment to Methodism, who were too conscientious and God-fearing to give their sanction to what they believed to be great iniquities, were excommunicated. Committees, imported from a distance for the purpose, expelled after the mockery of a trial, devoted men of God. All hope of a change for the better was cut off, and it being evident that the authorities of the Methodist Episcopal Church were determined to put down what devout souls believed to be the work of God, there was a convention of laymen and ministers who met in Niagara County, New York, on the 23rd of August, 1860, and adopted the following form of discipline. That's the very first gathering of the Free Methodist Church there on August 23rd in Peking, New York. We do not wish any to subscribe to this discipline unless they believe it will be for the glory of God and the good of their souls. We have no desire to get up simply a large church, but we do hope that our societies will be composed exclusively of those who are in earnest to gain heaven and who are determined by the grace of God to live up to the requirements of the Bible. Isn't that a tough, interesting paragraph? You don't subscribe to this unless you actually believe it, all these things. And we don't just want a big church. We hope our societies, our churches are composed of those who are in earnest to gain heaven and who are determined by the grace of God to live up to the requirements that we see in Scripture. When society is already organized, desire to unite with us, the Free Methodist Church, we recommend that they adopt the discipline as a whole. Don't piecemeal it. And then that each member be admitted in his own individual capacity as provided for in section 3rd of chapter 1st, entitled Of Receiving Members of the Church. It is of the greatest importance that those who come into the new organization be of one heart and of one mind. So what do you hear? Think about this. What insights do you hear in all of that about our doctrine, about the teaching? You hear holiness of heart and life, earnestness. You hear ministry to the poor. What about the Spirit? What about our culture? Don't join unless you're earnest, unless you agree that holiness of heart and life, biblical Christianity, ministry to people, changing culture, ministry to the poor is who we are. And then the discipline, we live up to what we say, and we do that together in connectionalism, in mutual accountability. You hear it all throughout these introduction to the first book of discipline. And I hope that you begin thinking that way about doctrine. What is it that we teach at our church? The Spirit. What's the culture that we're trying to gain? And what is the discipline of interconnectedness that we operate by? So that's our first discussion as Introduction to History and Polity, and we will see you for the next lecture.